I'd like to welcome you to this week's Tip of the Week. This week we're talking about short game and most importantly wedge selection. I have 3 different wedges here from Callaway and a few different offerings of what we consider bounces. I know bounce is a big buzzword that we always hear, but it's not always understood. Bounce of the club is the angle between the back of the club and the leading edge. With our wedges, this back sole part of the club is always going to sit lower than the leading edge. Reason being is that when we swing, we want the golf club to bounce off the turf. So there's 3 different styles of players. There are players that I would consider shallow players, meaning as the club goes back, it usually stays relatively close to the ground and relatively close to the ground as we go through. So if I were to use my dowel here, again, as the club goes back, it's going to stay relatively low to the ground, relatively low on the way through. You'll know you're one of these players if you do not often take a divot or you take a very little divot. We have the opposite end of the spectrum, which I have here, the 56-12, would be a steep angle of attack. That's going to be a player that as they take the club back, it gets very high, comes down very steep into the turf, and then exits very steep. Again, if I were to use my dowel here, you'll see that this angle is a lot steeper. A player like this is going to need more bounce. In this case, I have my 56-12. And then you're going to have your middle ground. In this case, I have my 56-10, where you're not going to be very steep, you're not going to be extremely shallow, you're going to be kind of in the middle of those two. Again, in this case, you're going to use a 56-10. What I would recommend to each player is if you're a player that does not take a divot, you're going to want to try something with a little less bounce. Now, how you're going to be able to find out which is the correct bounce for you? In this case, if I'm a steep player and I were to take my 56 with 8 degrees of bounce, or again, low bounce, as I set up and hit my shots, if I'm very steep and I have a little bounce on the club is going to tend to dig in. Now, if I take that same swing with a little bit more bounce, here I have the 56-12, you'll see that the club should glide off the turf. Now, again, if I'm a very shallow player and I use a lot of bounce, in this case, again, I'm using the 56-12, the club will go back low and through low. The tendency could be for the club to bounce off the turf and blade shots across the green. In this case, if I have a shallow swing with a lot of bounce, I can hit behind it and blade shots in. Again, there's 3 different bounces. I have the 56-08, low bounce, 56-10, middle bounce, and 56-12. If you have some time, definitely stop by on Tuesday from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Try these different bounces, and I guarantee you'll have a lot of success in your short game.